According to David's confession, the unusual relationship between the teacher and her former student had been going on for quite some time. David frequently visited Barbara's house, and every time he did, they engaged in inappropriate activities that both desired. Barbara never rejected David's advances, perhaps because she had been alone for so long. Eventually, she grew fond of the young man, who seemed confident and charming. Their relationship carried on in secret, hidden from everyone. Hello, and welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into another shocking real-life story from around the world. This time, the story takes us to Kayseri, a region in Turkey, where a schoolteacher found herself caught in a horrifying situation after taking a bath. What's surprising is that the incident involves someone she had known for years and considered close. The perpetrator's actions were reportedly fueled by an unhealthy obsession with adult content. What exactly happened in this case? Let's uncover the details. But before we get into the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. Alright, let's jump in. Meet Mrs. Barbara. Born in 1979 in Develi, Kayseri Province, Turkey, Barbara is an elementary school teacher. She started teaching at her current school in 2014 and quickly became known as a friendly and helpful educator. Barbara was actively involved in community and school events, often going the extra mile for her students. While some students found her a little strict and chatty, other teachers described her behavior as typical for maintaining discipline. Barbara's personal life, however, wasn't as smooth as her professional one. According to her colleagues, she got married in 2012. Unfortunately, her husband at the time was unreliable, abusive, and unfaithful. Barbara finally had enough and filed for divorce, which was finalized in 2015. Though she never had children, Barbara felt her decision to end the marriage was the right one. She endured constant emotional and physical abuse during her marriage. Her ex-husband wasn't just temperamental, he was also repeatedly caught cheating with other women. Instead of continuing to endure the pain, Barbara chose to live alone in her house and focus on her teaching career and her students' education. Life in Barbara's neighborhood could be described as peaceful and comfortable. She had lived in Kayseri since finishing her education, wanting to stay close to her workplace. The area was tight-knit, where most people knew each other, and crime rates were remarkably low. It was the kind of place where many felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. Even Barbara often did the same. She figured there wasn't much worth stealing in her house anyway, so she got used to it. But that sense of security was shattered in August 2019, when she found a man in her house who had entered without permission. That man was 17-year-old David. Now, David wasn't a stranger to Barbara. In fact, she'd known him for years. He lived just a few houses away, and Barbara even knew his parents well. More importantly, David had once been her student. When it came to David, the general consensus in the neighborhood wasn't exactly glowing. Many people saw him as a troublesome and rebellious kid. He often fought with his parents, stirred up trouble in the community, and frequently harassed his female classmates. Back in 2014, when David was in 5th grade, Barbara had been his homeroom teacher. From the start, David was an unruly and unmotivated student, which meant Barbara often had to scold him. He was even sent to the guidance counselor on multiple occasions for teasing and bothering the girls in his class. Things weren't much better between Barbara and David's parents. They didn't appreciate her labeling their son as a troublemaker with poor attention span and a bad attitude. In fact, it's safe to say the family harbored a grudge against her. The tension went back even further to 2013, when David wasn't promoted to the next grade. His parents had been furious. They even visited Barbara at her house, begging her to help get their son promoted. But the school's decision was final, and David stayed back a year. His parents were humiliated and blamed Barbara for the outcome, which only deepened their resentment toward her. Since June 2021, David, who's almost 17, discovered something surprising. Mrs. Barbara, who lives alone, rarely locks her door. Being a curious and mischievous teenager, he started sneaking into her house, sometimes waiting for her to come out of the shower. A few times, Mrs. Barbara caught him inside her house. But instead of making a big deal out of it, she just gave him a warning and went about her day. After that though, she started locking her door more often. But as they say, where there's a will, there's a way, and David wasn't about to give up that easily. He noticed her house didn't have iron bars on the windows, so he found other ways to sneak in. On one occasion, Mrs. Barbara caught David taking things from her room. Despite being upset, she didn't involve the police or the neighborhood chief. Instead, she scolded him and reported the incident to his parents, hoping to steer him in the right direction. Still, she couldn't keep it entirely to herself and confided in some neighbors and fellow teachers at her school. While some encouraged her to report him to the authorities, others reminded her to stay cautious, especially since she lived alone. For now, Mrs. Barbara has chosen patience, but she's keeping an eye on the situation. On the evening of July 7, 2021, David went to Mrs. Barbara's house after watching adult videos. Finding the door locked from the inside, he pried open a window and quietly slipped in. At the time, Mrs. Barbara was in the bathroom, so David hid in the kitchen nearby, waiting for her to come out. When she finally stepped out, David startled her by touching her back and demanded something inappropriate. This time, unlike before, Mrs. Barbara firmly refused. Her rejection enraged David, who, overcome with frustration and desire, grabbed her and pressed his hand tightly against her neck until she stopped resisting. After rendering her defenseless, David dragged Mrs. Barbara to the living room, where he committed a vile act. Her resistance and screams for help made him panic. Desperate to silence her, he grabbed a sofa cover and wrapped it around her neck until her cries stopped entirely. Tragically, Mrs. Barbara lost her life. Even after this horrifying act, David continued his despicable behavior. Once done, he carried Mrs. Barbara's lifeless body to the bathroom, placing her face down in the bathtub. Before leaving, he locked the front door from the outside and slid the key back under the door. The neighborhood was eerily quiet that night, and no one saw David as he slipped away. The following day, Mrs. Patricia, a fellow teacher, decided to visit Mrs. Barbara's house after school. She found it odd that Barbara hadn't shown up to teach and thought she'd check in while also retrieving a notebook she had left with her. When Patricia arrived, the house was locked, and despite knocking several times, there was no response. Assuming Barbara wasn't home, Patricia left. The next morning, still concerned, Patricia received a call from Christopher, Barbara's cousin, who was out of town. Christopher mentioned he had been trying to reach Barbara since the day before, but her phone was off. Worried, he asked Patricia to stop by and check on her. Around 8 a.m., before heading to school, Patricia and her husband, Joseph, stopped by Barbara's house again. After knocking and receiving no response, Joseph entered through a window and unlocked the door from the inside. Something felt off, and Patricia's gut told her something was wrong. Searching the house, they found Barbara's lifeless body in the bathtub, partially covered with a sofa cover. Shocked, Patricia and Joseph immediately reported their discovery to the neighborhood authorities and contacted the police. Officers quickly arrived, cordoned off the area, and transported Barbara's body to the hospital for an autopsy. The doctors confirmed that she had been murdered, and the police began a full investigation. They questioned neighbors, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual or seen someone entering Barbara's house in the past few days. Initially, no one reported seeing anything suspicious. However, some neighbors mentioned David as a possible suspect, as Barbara had often shared concerns about his behavior and how he frequently snuck into her house. Following this lead, the police went to David's house, where they found him casually playing video games. When officers arrived, David attempted to flee through the back door but was immediately stopped by other officers stationed there. While searching the house, police discovered a Samsung phone with Barbara's photo as the wallpaper. Although the phone was locked, it was clear the SIM card had been changed. Faced with this evidence, David finally confessed to killing Mrs. Barbara, unraveling the tragic truth behind her untimely death. During interrogations and press conferences, David claimed he committed the crime out of a lingering grudge from his school days. He said he resented Mrs. Barbara for scolding him and calling him a troublemaker back then. However, His family and former teachers dismissed this as a flimsy excuse. They pointed out that being reprimanded by teachers is something all students experience, and it's done with good intentions. Holding a grudge for years over being scolded for not doing homework or misbehaving seemed irrational to them. In reality, many believed David's true motive was his desire to act on inappropriate intentions toward Mrs. Barbara. After further questioning by the police, David eventually confessed the full truth, which shocked everyone, especially Barbara's fellow teachers. David admitted that before going to Barbara's house, he had watched adult videos and planned to confront her with indecent demands. He revealed that this wasn't the first time he had gone to her house with such intentions, and claimed that Barbara had never refused him in the past. However, on that particular day, when Barbara firmly refused, David, already overcome with his desires, became enraged. His frustration escalated, leading to the horrific events that followed. The chilling confession left everyone deeply disturbed, mourning not just the loss of Mrs. Barbara but the tragic circumstances of her final moments. After David's confession, some of Barbara's teaching colleagues admitted they weren't entirely shocked. Rumors about an unusual relationship between Barbara and David had circulated among the teachers, and several neighbors also pointed out that David and his family weren't well liked in the area due to their history of causing trouble. Despite all this, Barbara had always been kind to David and his family, even when she had every reason to report him to the authorities for theft, trespassing, and other inappropriate behavior. Barbara's kindness, however, seemed to extend too far. According to David's account, what started as tolerance for his mischief eventually turned into something more. Barbara, it seemed, had developed feelings for David's rebellious demeanor, and their relationship took a turn into something inappropriate. David claimed their unusual relationship had been going on for quite some time. He regularly visited Barbara's house, and each time, they engaged in acts they both consented to. Barbara never turned him away, which David attributed to her loneliness. Over time, she allegedly grew fond of the young man, whom she saw as charming in his own way, and their secret relationship deepened. When the case went to trial at the High Court of Kayseri, David had little to defend his actions. While he admitted to killing Barbara, he argued that it wasn't premeditated, claiming he panicked when she resisted him that day. However, the judge disagreed, pointing out the deliberate nature of David's repeated visits to her home, which often involved trespassing and planned acts. In the end, David was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict brought some closure to the community, though the tragic and complicated circumstances of Barbara's life and death continued to weigh heavily on those who knew her. What lessons can we learn from this story? You can comment below.